Well, welcome to another episode of Newcastle Unlocked. I'm your host, Brent Sinclair, and it's our first episode back for 2025, so great to have everyone back. And today we'll be discussing the current and future landscape for development in Newcastle and the Hunter. And we're thrilled to have our very special guest here today, the Honourable Stuart Ayres, CEO of the Urban Development Institute of Australia for New South Wales. And prior to that, he also held position in a senior cabinet member of the New South Wales government. So got a very unique perspective on all things development. We're hoping to gain some of his insights on the opportunities for the Hunter, really. So thanks for joining us today, Stuart.
No, it's great to be here. I now feel like I've sat on both sides of the table.
And that's what, we want to really pick at that. So you're in Newcastle today for the UDIA luncheon. We've got representatives from all the councils coming in to speak today. What are you hoping to get out of this luncheon today? What do you hope to see?
Yeah, so it's a really strong start for the UDIA in the Hunter region in 2025. I think that's a reflection of the quality and strength of our membership. Over 200 people across the property sector gathering today. We're running a really interesting panel with the planning managers and directors from the 5 lower Hunter councils. So there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm amongst our membership to hear what those decision makers and influencers inside councils across this region are going to be saying. We're also at a really interesting period of time generally in both political cycles and I think economic cycles around housing. I'm sure we'll touch on interest rate changes, which have just been announced in the last couple of days. There's a federal election just around the corner. There's a state government in New South Wales that talks a lot about housing but is struggling to get housing started. So there's a lot of things that'll be on the mind of people who are earning their keep through property, and they've all turned up to a UDIA event today to learn a little bit more.
Excellent. And can you tell us a little bit about your role as the CEO for New South Wales and what led you to that role as well?
Yeah. So the Urban Development Institute of Australia is effectively an industry association for people engaged in property development. People might have been or might be familiar with the Property Council as another industry peak. So between the Property Council and us, we probably represent the bulk of people engaged in property development and property management, building and construction. So we spend our time as an advocacy body for those members into governments. We also provide a great opportunity for members to interact and meet with each other, do a lot of networking. We know that those personal networks and personal contacts, particularly between a lot of our consulting members and our development members or people in professional services, those that are engaged in the sales and transaction side. So creating a really great environment for those types of activities to take place. Bit of professional development work as well, always looking to upskill and improve the quality of people. So that's what UDIA does. But we're primarily an industry peak, that membership-based industry association to be a really strong voice for the outcomes that we're looking for, which is more places people can call home, to government to make sure that we've got the most development-friendly policy settings going around.
Excellent. And as you know, what's some of the initiatives and objectives for the UDIA for the Hunter region? I know you've got a chapter here or a local group that work for you, but what's some of the objectives here for the Hunter that you're working on? Yeah,
so I think the Hunter is really a bit of a microcosm of what you see right across the state. If you think about where the bulk of housing has got to come in New South Wales, about 322,000 dwellings out of the statewide target of 377,000 have to come out of the Sydney Megaregion, which includes the Hunter and Central Coast. And Newcastle and the Hunter are a really kind of interesting mini snapshot of what that looks like. So you've got a more densely populated, pre-existing city in Newcastle, and then you've got emerging locations to the west of Newcastle. And so you do have this natural greenfield infill split that takes place here. UDIA does spend a lot of time engaging with government to say, whilst we understand the infrastructure benefits of having infill development, and those infrastructure benefits are very much for government, the feasibility of a lot of that infill development is incredibly challenging in the current time. So you need to make sure you don't take your eye off the ball of the greenfield development front. And I think both here in Newcastle City or Newcastle Council area, as well as some of those other councils that are around like Maitland and Cessnock, it's important that we keep the infrastructure spend from both a local government as well as a state government perspective. And with a federal election just around the corner, it's always a pretty good time to be telling people around the benefits of investing in enabling infrastructure to allow housing supply.
And, that's been a big topic of conversation. There's some incredible housing targets to be met by councils, but as you pointed out, the feasibility of the project needs to stack up. And even working within our sphere, we're talking with a lot of developers, and that's the piece that's challenging at the moment. You're talking about enabling infrastructure, but what is your opinion on some of these targets? And I know that UDIA talk a lot about enabling infrastructure and whatnot. What do you think about some of these targets and where we're headed, really, even from a statewide level?
Yeah, well, there's an old management saying that if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. And so I think that the targets that have been put in place that are built out of the National Housing Accord. So this is not one government operating in isolation. This is a national approach to say, we know we have a significant housing supply shortfall. We have to correct that. And what do the numbers look like to put us on the right trajectory to be able to close that gap down? And so nationally, the Housing Accord made a commitment around delivering 1.2 million homes out to 2029, 377,000 of those to come from New South Wales, 322,000 of that to come across that Sydney Megaregion, which is where the bulk of the population is. So sort of 55,000 coming out in a very disaggregated way across regional New South Wales. Once you get to that number, you're just sort of dividing it up amongst the local councils around their capacity to take on growth. And that's where the state government comes in and it provisions and puts that number out there. Now, that number's always going to be contested. Councils will say, we can't achieve that. Some councils will say that we're already on a trajectory and we shouldn't have this benchmark. But I like the idea of a number being out there because it allows us to ask the questions around the things that we could be doing better. We shouldn't shy away from having that level of accountability. And right now, we know nationally, but here in New South Wales, that we're tracking well behind that target. All that means over the medium term is at the end of this 5-year period, we're going to start the next 5-year period well behind. So that means that curve's just going to have to be steeper to close that gap down. So what I would like to see over the next few years is less of a focus around whether that number is too high or too low, except that, that's a number. That number is what we all decided we needed to be getting towards to make housing more affordable over the medium to long term by increasing supply. And be less worried about the number and be more focused on solutions and ideas that'll help us achieve them.
And you touched on it. We are tracking behind with housing. Talk about the numbers. You can talk them all day. But actually, delivery of houses. What practical impacts on the market is a shortage of housing in the short to medium term going to look like? Obviously, it looks like there's going to be pressure on rents, pressure on pricing. Had an interest rate cut this week.
Yeah.
What do you see for the next? How dramatic is it going to be in the short to medium term, or is it a slow burn?
I think everything is a slowish burn, but the fire feels like it's burning faster these days. If you're a person trying to get into the market, your borrowing capacity over the last few years has been dramatically reduced by 11 consecutive interest rate rises. So seeing the corner turn on those interest rates coming down rather than going up. But if you're trying to enter the market, everyone else who's already in the market's got additional borrowing capacity as well. And if you don't make serious inroads on that supply constraint, then you're still going to have demand fundamentally, if not significantly outstripping supply. And any Year 12 student filling out their economics essay for the HSC is probably writing some paragraphs saying that when demand outstrips supply, then price on that curve only goes up. So if you want to slow the escalating rate of house prices, we have to increase supply. That is just a fundamental position. I recently had a conversation with the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner in the last week or so. He's produced a report for the state government to potentially implement a series of policy initiatives. He fundamentally talks about the idea of increasing supply as the only way to make housing more affordable over the medium to long term. So UDIA is very committed to this idea, and we help governments formulate policy that will increase supply across the market.
And there's a few strategies for that increasing supply. Obviously, you've got density approaches. We're talking about affordable housing is a big thing, build to rent as well. Are you seeing much of that actually, I would say, still specialised or fringe approach, especially in affordable housing? Are you seeing that as a short to medium term solution as part of this equation? Is that?
Yeah, so I think governments are starting to work out where do they deploy their funds. So we should not lose sight that 97% of housing in Australia is delivered by the private sector. So if you want more homes built, you need private capital building those homes. And so what we're starting to see with social and affordable housing policy from a government perspective, whether it be federal or state government, is investments by the government into social and affordable housing via incentives for the private sector to be able to help deliver those homes. So increased density provisions. They don't always work as effectively as what governments think they will. And the main reason for that is that in a lot of cases, additional supply of social and affordable housing in a subsidised way in a feasibility stack is a cost. And so the incentive has got to outweigh the cost for it to motivate people to build more of them. But I think if you want more, if you need more properties built, you've got to keep making it easier for the private sector to deploy its capital.
And in that frame of speak, with, providing higher densities, enabling, more and more approvals, but also a lot of the feedback we're getting from developers is the cost for contributions and, some of the limitations with, actually at a site specific level, ecology, et cetera. Are you seeing any movement from councils in you're trying to tackle it that way in terms of reducing costs, maybe streamlining some of those processes?
Yeah, so I think we should group the governments together. I don't think we necessarily need to single out councils or a particular council. All of the people listening to this will have their own experiences with those individually. But what can governments do that will allow capital to get to market faster? So I think there's some fundamental principles here. One is invest more of the money that they collect from taxpayers in enabling infrastructure, because that enabling infrastructure facilitates private capital to pull a house or a townhouse or an apartment out of the ground. And then there's the next thing that they can do is be as efficient as they possibly can be in the way in which they process applications. So the development applications, planning proposals, and we're seeing the state government look at creating new pathways for larger scale developments, the establishment of the Housing Delivery Authority that puts the Secretary of Planning, the CEO of Infrastructure New South Wales and the Secretary of DPC as a bit of a troika, if you wanted to think of it as that, as an assessment panel to pull more projects through to a state significant development status. And even just in the last week, we saw the first tranche of those being assessed and pulled into that state significant pathway. So the state government is definitely looking at ways in which it can be more efficient. There's some positive steps, I think, coming from the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition around a bipartisan approach to reforming the Planning Act. Hasn't had substantial reform in 40 years. It's probably nearly twice as large by paper size as what it was when it was first established. So that means a lot of things have been added to it. Almost always in life, when you add more things, that increases complexity. Complexity slows things down. That means capital doesn't get to where it needs to be. So I do think councils and governments are making some effort in the right direction, but there's still a lot of frustration out there. And then the other challenge that I think they've got is how much of the infrastructure cost, which we often refer to as developer contributions, has to come from the people buying the home. This developer contribution phrase, I think, is an utterly terrible phrase. It's a shocker because the developer is not the entity that's paying that cost. Ultimately, that's paid for by the home buyer. It's a cost that's built into the end price. The developer might pay for it at particular stages of construction or through the course of a project. One of our strong advocacy pieces to the Productivity Commissioner was to charge contributions at OC stage, not earlier in the project, to improve cash flows through the course of a development. That means a project gets completed, I think, more efficiently and faster. And that will mean that the government can collect its clip of the ticket at the back end and ensure that infrastructure is delivered and roll that money into the next piece of infrastructure. But we shouldn't really delude ourselves here. The cost of infrastructure for a developer is a cost that's ultimately borne by the home buyer. And so a more accurate term would be a home buyer's contribution. And the way I think about this is if you created an A4 marketing flyer and you put the price at the bottom, if we actually created a bottom line for that price that says, here's what the land cost and here's what the house costs, and then here are all the other costs that you've got to pay, I wonder whether the consumer would start to say, should I be making that level of contribution to a public road, to a public park, or should that cost be borne by a much wider group of people? And if you wanted to flip it around, I always have an image of a swimming pool in my head in this idea. It's like, so we've got a new suburb, council goes out. In fact, I saw a mayor in Sydney on Channel 9, saying we want to build a new pool, and the way to do that is to increase development contributions. I often thought, what happens if all of the home buyers of those new houses go, yeah, I paid for that pool so no one else can use it. And so all of a sudden it wouldn't be a public pool, it'd be a closed estate pool, but it was paid for by that cohort of home buyers. If you made it available to everyone else, should the wider base pay for that infrastructure? Does that mean councils have got to think differently about rate bases? These are the types of discussions that we've got to have. But when you're talking about a couple of $100,000 and the price of a home is 1.4 instead of 1.2 million, we've just spoken about, or just flagged the idea of a 0.25% or 25 basis point rate cut. $200,000 of additional infrastructure contributions just blows the value of even 100-point rate cut out of the water, right? So I think we've got to have a more mature and transparent conversation about who's actually paying for infrastructure, and are we asking a small rate base in the new homeowner to cover too much of that cost? It gets wrapped up as a developer contribution, but ultimately it's the home buyer that's paying.
No, it's great context to put it like that, because that's exactly what's happening. And it's hard to think, it sort of gets blended into it all, but really that's how we're...
Look, ultimately the bank decides what the profit margin is for the developer. They go, this is the amount of, this is the margin we need to see in your project for us to finance this project. And when I say bank, I use that as a kind of collective term for financing, but whoever's lending the money sets that margin, and that margin doesn't include the cost of the infrastructure. That cost is borne by the home buyer at the end, in the end ticket price.
So that's, I suppose, looking at Newcastle specifically, and I know you've got a very, your perspective is across the state, and you've got a team working here in Newcastle. What challenges do you see our region facing in terms of getting through to this housing supply? And look, I know you're big, there's a whole bunch of strategies we've spoken about. Infrastructure is a big one. Is it about infrastructure for us? And do you see a pathway forward for us to meet the targets, enable these costs, or is it still more at a macro level?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we should drill down on. We've spoken a little bit about infrastructure, but in the context of the Lower Hunter, UDIA produced at the back end of last year a building blocks report, which is a regular piece of research that we do across the Hunter, Central Coast, Illawarra. We're also looking at doing one in Western Sydney as well. And that project found that if we invested $420 million in enabling infrastructure across the Lower Hunter, we'd be able to bring on almost 29,000 additional properties. And there's a lot of small projects where there's a gap in funding for the provision of a piece of infrastructure. And that might be, an additional off-ramp at Sparks Road on the Central Coast, or it might be improvements to highway interchange that allows for a parcel of land to be released and developed and built on. Now, there's probably some infrastructure contributions that have been allocated to those projects, but then there's a gap. And so that money sort of sits there allocated against a piece of infrastructure. It's not doing anything because that infrastructure is not being built because there's not enough money to start that project. So we think this is where government should really be focused, is closing down those gaps. There's already a developer contribution provision sitting against that project. So if you can bring some capital, get that infrastructure completed, then that'll open up more development sites, which brings on more land and more development sites for more houses to be built. So that's definitely the first thing. The second thing is across Central Coast and Hunter, we still see a lot of constraint around environmental constraints and the way in which biodiversity laws are applied across the state, but particularly in these regions. We need to be able to strike an appropriate balance between the environment and development. We've got to be able to have trees and houses. It's not having either or, that both need to work. And so what we've got to be able to do is ensure that there's less bites at the cherry on the biodiversity claim across sites.
Yep.
That's going to give greater clarity for investors and developers. It's also going to give greater clarity for the community as well, because they know where property can be developed and they know where environment outcomes are being protected. And that's a good thing. At the moment, there's way too much ambiguity in that. And that ambiguity and that lack of clarity creates risk, and that risk gets priced in and also slows projects down. Yeah. And then the third area is efficiency in planning systems. We just need our council staff, we need our state governments, and particularly the agencies that are responsible for a lot of consents. So one of the things I get a little bit worried about that comes out of the creation of league tables and who's processing DAs is what constitutes a DA approval doesn't mean that project's then approved to start construction. Yeah. And so I think a better measurement, or an area where a lot more transparency is needed, is tracking what happens between a development application approval and the issuance of a construction certificate. And I suspect a lot of people listening to this podcast would have particular state agencies in mind that they are waiting on consents for, that with those consents they'd be able to start. And so there's not a lot of transparency on that. And I do feel sometimes for people inside the Department of Planning and inside councils, they've actually done their job, and now there's some people somewhere else in the government system that's holding something up. And the criticism that you hear in the media, or you hear through, pub conversations or coffee chats, is, it's the planning system. It's those planners that have got this, holding us up. It's probably some consents related to specific agencies further down the line.
And in that same discussion about improving and streamlining processes, the UDIA talks about, the Greater Sydney Megaregion connectivity, bringing that together. Is that included as part of the planning process? Are you hoping that would, creating something like a mega region would start to streamline some of those efficiencies, or is that just more about infrastructure and such?
No, I think we definitely should be thinking about those locations. One of the things that I hope that comes out of the UDIA engagement they're doing at our lunch today with the planning directors of those 5 lower Hunter councils is those 5 lower Hunter council planning directors meet more frequently. Yeah. The way in which humans operate is not dictated by a council boundary. We don't get to checkpoint Charlie between Port Stephens and Newcastle, or Newcastle and Cessnock, right? So or Maitland and Cessnock. The world doesn't change when you drive along the highway and you move into the next council. But from an administrative perspective, it can feel very differently. So I think there should be a lot more collaboration and understanding of sequencing, more engagement with industry. Ultimately, we're all trying to do the same thing, and that's right. Just build more homes, whether it's an apartment or a detached house or a townhouse. So I think the more we collaborate together, the better outcomes that we'll get. The Sydney Megaregion is really, in my view, just a statement of fact. It's a geographical part of New South Wales that runs from Wollongong to Newcastle. It's where the overwhelming majority of people in this state live. It's where the disproportionate amount of infrastructure is invested. It's definitely where an even greater disproportionate amount of jobs are required. And so we should think about it as a holistic region. And it definitely makes us think differently about the sequencing of infrastructure as well.
Very, very interesting. Switching to some of the more topical, newsworthy things at the moment, we've had an interest rate cut this week. It's been on, the topic of conversation for quite a while. When it's going to happen, what does that mean? The election, without sort of going to the election just yet, what do you see now that we've had a rate cut? How much of an impact do you see that having on the housing market? Again, probably in the vein of enabling housing and construction. Where do you see that? And it's only a 25 basis points cut, but where do you see that going?
Well, it's kind of like turning the corner, right? Like we've been on this trajectory now for 4 years. There's 11 consecutive interest rate rises. And so all people have had to do is eat more cost with not a lot of benefit associated with it. So I think the first one's always going to feel and be talked about more because it's the first in a long period of time. It's the first reduction in a long period of time. And it's a reflection that perhaps we're now starting to get past the full overhang of COVID and the disruption to supply chains, the impact on employment. I think the RBA, that when I say bank there. I think the RBA will be very focused on unemployment. We still have a very low rate of employment in Australia by national standards, and that basically is a very clear indicator to the RBA that the output of the economy is outstripping the capacity of the economy to deliver that.
Yep.
That's an inflationary pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, if they start to see unemployment rise, they'll be more open to further rate cuts. And I think people want to see that. If you've got a house, obviously, it makes it a little bit easier, but it also improves the borrowing capacity for people trying to get in.
Yeah.
And developers trying to finance projects too.
And the federal election's coming up, hasn't been called yet. What, I'll get your prediction. When's that going to, when do you think they're going to call the election, and why? And how is that going to impact what your objectives are for the UDIA in any way? Do you think that it's going to have a major impact? Which government is in? Do you have a preference? What's your, and when do you think the election's going to be held?
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister's running out of Saturdays to have an election. So look, I don't think I'm Robinson Crusoe on this, but it looks like April 12 looks like a pretty increasingly sort of obvious date. If it's not then, it's probably going to be pretty close to that. Yep. For the people listening to this podcast on the eastern seaboard of Australia, it's probably worth reminding them that there's a state election happening in Western Australia right now. The Labor Party won 4 seats off the coalition in the 2022 election that had a profound impact on the Prime Minister being able to form a majority government. So I don't think we should underestimate how important it is for a Labor Prime Minister who's won those seats to allow for that West Australian election to be conducted and be clear, have clean air in WA. With almost certainly a re-elected Labor government, the margin there is very, very large. So I think that's probably a factor that doesn't get spoken about enough on the East Coast in the media around the impact of timing. So that's on the 8th of March. He's got to call an election by mid-May. There's just not that many Saturdays between that particular point of time, accounting for, I think 33 days or something along those lines that an election has to be conducted over as a minimum period of time. Could be longer. So yeah, I think we're talking mid-April as the time frame. The immediate impact of elections often is to slow everything down. People actually stop because it's the ultimate injection of uncertainty. Is there going to be a big change in direction across the country, or are we going to continue on the course that we're on at the moment? And, the joy of living in a democracy is that citizens get an opportunity to make that decision. But what tends to happen in election periods is that capital just stops being deployed and people wait until they see that decision by the citizens around what they do with it. So I think there'll be an immediate slowdown and some caution around what happens. And then secondly, probably the most important thing is that you will hear a lot about housing in this election, and it'll be housing through the broader context of how the economy is performing, and then the household budget. And so that the cost of the house, whether it be for a renter or for a mortgage holder, is just taking up such a larger portion of the budget than what it is, the household budget, than what it has done historically. And so that'll be occupying the mind of many a politician who's at a street stall and listening post. And particularly here in the Hunter, I think this is almost the most important geographical area in the country for this election. There are across the states various seats that people will be focused on, but as far as a concentration of seats between Dobell, Robinson, Shortland, which I think is the most underestimated seat in the country, I'd be watching that seat very closely. I think it will be a very tight contest there. Seats like Hunter, and Patterson. So in a relatively short area, geographical space, there's probably 3 to 4 seats that are going to be hotly contested, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Central Coast and Hunter determine the course of the country.
Great predictions. Well, look, we might leave it there. And I really do appreciate you coming in and talking all things property, and some great insight shared across a number of sectors. And we're really keen to see what the outcome of this luncheon today and follow the journey for the UDIA over the next little while. But appreciate you coming in today, Stuart.
No, it's great to be here. I'm really bulshy about the future of Newcastle. I I think it's a city that's got great infrastructure, great bones, hardworking people, a good blend of infill and greenfield opportunities. So if that means people are ringing Knight Frank for a bit of advice around where to buy and put some of their money, then Newcastle's a good place to be looking at.
Thanks for joining us, mate.
Cheers.
That's all from us. We'll be sure to keep you updated throughout the year.
Cool.